to say hello. Thanks.
Hi guys. So lots of people I know, so I won't greet you individually. The only people who will come to hear me are the people I know, I think. Or maybe the people who won't come to hear me then. Erika and Rajesh, what I'm not going to do is to look at the comments. That's just a bit too distracting.
We will do that. We will do that, and we will pass all the comments over to Erika. Don't worry about that.
Okay, good.
So I think we can start, Erika. Please unmute.
Yes. So good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I believe Justina is going to take us into the session, right, Rajesh?
Rajesh, you're muted. Welcome everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from. So I'm Justina Onoma. I'm a senior research scientist with the Science and Technology Policy Research Institute in Ghana here. I'll be your anchor for today. Today's conversation is a third series of the In Conversation series being organized by CHRIS.org, which is a Christopher Freeman Innovation System.org. It is a virtual organization formed by alumni of GlobalX, mainly from the Global South, and it is co-organized with the UniMerit. The In Conversation series portrays prominent innovation scholars like what we are going to have today in the form of intellectual biographical interviews with other senior scholars. So today's series is a third of the first earlier two series that have happened, and it promises to be very engaging and thought-provoking. We have Raphael Kaplinski, who will be interviewed by Erika Kramer-Imbula. And I must say that these two scholars inspire me so much in so many ways. So I'm very excited to be on this platform with them today. And it's a very great privilege and honor for me to moderate this session with them. So it's going to be a 2-hour session. It's going to be split into two. So the first hour, we'll have Erika interview Raphie. And after that, we'll go on a 5-minute break. After the break, we'll have some senior panelists, Carlota Perez, Norma Clark, and Mike Morris, who will take turns and ask their questions as well. And subsequently, we'll open the floor to the general audience. And whilst we do that, we want to encourage each and every one of us to type in their questions in the chat box. We also would like to give opportunity for you to also ask your questions by putting on your microphone and then your video as well. We'll do our best to answer all your questions, and then that is Raphie and Erika will be able to help us answer all the questions that come today. So I would like to introduce Professor Erika Kramer-Imbula, who is a professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa. She is a proud member of the Africa List Scientific Board and the president of GlobalX. She is currently the chairholder of the Trilateral Chair in Transformative Innovation and the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
I believe the connection from Justina has stopped. I think while we wait for her to get back, if it's okay, Rajesh, may I continue?
Please take over.
So I can,
please take.
Yes, great. I can continue the introduction of myself actually. So so yes, it's a pleasure to be here today. And thanks to Chris.org for organizing this event and for bringing this team of people together. It's going to be a very interesting conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So as Justina was busy introducing myself, so I'm at the University of Johannesburg, and I'm part of a trilateral chair, which is an international collaboration between the University of Johannesburg, the African Center for Technology Studies, ACTS in Kenya, and the Science Policy Research Unit, SPRU, at the University of Sussex. Thanks Rajesh and team for putting this together. Again, this is Chris.org, a meeting, which is a group of Global X alumni that is putting together these fantastic events and bringing the community together. If I may start the session, because time is running and we want to use this precious time to hear from Raphie, as well as the three great discussants that we have today. Let me start with a brief introduction of Professor Raphael Kaplinsky. I will take a few minutes just to introduce him before we move into the conversation. So it's really an honor to introduce, if I may, Raphie Kaplinsky. He's currently an honorary professor at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex in the UK. And he's also an emeritus professor at the Institute of Development Studies and at the Open University, both in the UK. In these three organizations, he's been much more than just a prolific scholar. He has played a central role in helping to define and implement their strategic direction at various times. His academic career started more than 50 years ago. And during this time, Raphie has made numerous and major contributions to the literature. And these contributions, to a large extent, I would say, have shaped the field of innovation and development as we currently know it today. And we'll get to talk about that over the next couple of hours. Some of these contributions have emerged from large and highly influential global research programs, which he has initiated and managed, such as the one on global value chains and global Asian drivers, among others. I think it's important to note that Raphie was born and raised in South Africa, but left to the UK as a political refugee in 1969. And although the UK became his main home, I think Africa never left him. That's what I like to think, and I think that is correct. We'll hear from him. You know what they say, you may leave Africa, but Africa doesn't leave you. He was in Kenya for some years, and with South Africa's liberation in the early 1990s, he was able to travel to South Africa again. It was at that time in the early 1990s that he started working quite intensively with the South African government on industrial policy, and was deeply involved in industrial strategy development in the post-apartheid era. Here is where I would like to highlight Raphie's origins in political activism and his continuous involvement and advice that he's given to policy processes in various countries and regions, not only in his home country in South Africa, but also in other African countries, as well as the Caribbean and Southern Europe. This connection between research and policy has been an ongoing theme, I would say a connecting thread throughout his career. And I have questions about that for Raphie that we'll discuss later on. Over the past 4 decades, he's been an engaged scholar, can be said. He's been working with policymakers, private sector, trade unions, and civil society groups. I have personally known Raphie since my early years as a master's student at SPRU, and he remained a point of reference and support during my PhD years and beyond. I'm lucky to count him as one of my mentors, but I'm by no means unique. Raphie has mentored many across the world, supervising PhDs and supporting early career scholars, formally and informally, especially in the Global South. And they have gone on to become leaders in their own spaces and fields. So the ripple effects of his influence, I think, is much wider than what is listed in his CV. Raphie has authored countless books and academic papers on technology, industrialization, globalization, and more recently, sustainability. And in terms of his academic contributions, well, I'm not going to try and summarize his academic contributions in this introduction, but I think it's better to hear from Raphie himself. So let's move on to the questions. Hi, Raphie.
Hi, Erika. Before we move on to questions, we all operate in a community, and a lot of the things that are under my name and appear to be Kaplinski or Raphie are really things which we've all done and we work together. So you referred to me as being a mentor to young people. I'm sure I've learned as much from young people as they've learned from me. So this is a collectivity, and I hope during the course of this conversation, the extent of cooperation and of joint production of knowledge, and also the joint action to try and change the world, will become increasingly apparent. But thanks for your introduction.
Great. We'll hopefully get a chance to talk about collaboration and collective development of knowledge in some of these large projects that you've led at various times. I will spend a few minutes talking about your formative years and your major influences. You were born and raised in South Africa. How did growing up in apartheid South Africa shape your view of the world and your perspectives and your priorities when it comes to intellectual inquiry?
It's unavoidable. The two of the themes in my life, one is the concern with equity and the distribution of power and voice. And also the need to be involved as actors as well, also as observers of the world. Both are fundamentally, I regard them as central to my being, and they come from being brought up in South Africa. In those days, I mean, there were of course many white South Africans who supported the regime, but if you had any soul at all, you had to be driven by those two elements. So I would say there's an absolute continuity between what happened in my life as a child and what happened in my parents' lives when they were children, and passing through the ages with myself, my ex-students, my colleagues, and of course my children as well. So yes, South Africa, my upbringing in South Africa was absolutely critical.
Did you always know that academia and research was going to be the way forward for you?
Yes, I'm slightly balking at the words academia and research because I see myself as an activist as well. But I never thought in other directions. It felt a bit like being in an escalator. It just followed one step followed on another.
Okay. Who were your mentors or your inspiration at that time?
Well, in South Africa, of course, the mentors were partly political activists and one or two lecturers, both of whom have died very recently. Coming to England, I moved to the IDS. I was accepted as a political refugee. And Charles Cooper was a formative person in my life. Now, I know many of the modern audience of innovation studies aren't familiar with the role which Charles Cooper played. And if you look at his work and look him up, you won't find a lot of published materials. But he played an absolutely central role in my life, as well also as in the development of our field. So Charles Cooper was important. Chris Feeman, of course, was critical. My first job was at Sprue. And then I also want to highlight the role played by Robin Murray, who was at the IDS and also became a very influential thinker and activist in the modern day world. So if you were asking for mentors, I would go for, in that order, chronologically, Charles, Chris, Robin, and recently, and I see her sitting in front of me, Carlotta, my dear friend. So those four people have made a big impact on my life.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about how each of these individuals and what key ideas did you take from these inspiration sources?
I entered innovation studies in the early 1970s when it wasn't really a field. And I entered innovation studies in developing countries, which was even more neglected. So in those days, the developing world was heavily dependent upon the rich countries. It was said that 98% of the world's research and development occurred in the rich countries, and that the developing countries were essentially dependent on technology transferred from the rich countries. That technology was said to be inappropriate because it was developed in a context of high wages, cheap access to capital, good infrastructure. And so the concern was there the possibility in developing countries of choosing technologies which were more appropriate? And the assertion in economic theory was that they just didn't exist. All the technology being developed in the world was technology coming from the rich countries, and the developing countries had no option but to use that technology. Now, Charles Cooper, the ILO World Employment Program, Francis Stewart and others challenged that assertion. Was it in fact the case that there was no choice of technology? So during the early 70s, an awful lot of the discussion in the innovation studies literature was very empirically based. You know, what was the extent of choice? Martin Bell and myself and others worked on the tin canning industry, glass bottles industry, just trying to explore the idea that there was more technology choice available than appeared to be the case. A second part of that story was, since the developing world was dependent on technology from rich countries, they would pay excessive prices for the technology. So the costs of technology transfer was a second important dimension. So if you were asking, since this community I'm talking to at the moment is predominant in innovation community, the 1970s innovation studies in development was essentially around these two issues: the extent and range of choice of technology and the costs of technology, and how to minimize the costs of developing countries being dependent on technology imported from the rich countries. So that's the 70s. You want to go to the 80s? Of course, Chris Freeman steps onto the stage. And Chris, as many of you know, was predominantly an analyst of what was happening in the rich countries. He had an abiding interest in development. And I believe it was in 1979, there was a program on British television called Now the Chips Are Down. And it was really about the impact, potential impact of electronics on the world. And Chris's role, for me at any rate in the 1980s, was to draw to my attention the fact that we were beginning to experience a major technological revolution of historical importance. And that move from the micro level studies of the 1970s to trying to see the big picture, opened up by Chris Freeman and explored by his group at SPRU, and most productively recently by Carlotta, has been a theme which has carried through and frames the way I think about the innovation story, if that's really what the story of development is about.
I'm going to take us back to that work on technological choices. And there was, at that time, there was quite a lot of interactions, or it seems, between the multilateral organizations, the UN, the World Bank, and so on, and the academic community at the time, shaping those discussions. Were you involved in these discussions, and what is your perception of what was going on there?
Yes, so in the early 1970s, when I was working at the IDS and SPRU, the big development innovation technology debate was about unemployment. And there were a series of very influential employment missions, originally in Colombia, then in Sri Lanka, which I was one, then in Kenya, then in a few other countries. And I would say that the international organization of significance was significantly the International Labour Organization, working together with IDEAS, SPRU, Chris Freeman a little bit, Charles centrally, Francis Stewart, and Hans Singer and Richard Jolly. So the debate then was essentially the international institution debate was the implications of capital-intensive technologies, of labor displacing technologies, and what that had to say about the mass unemployment in developing countries. So the ILO, the World Bank didn't enter the story for many decades. The UN, UNDP had some role earlier on as an implementing agency, as did UNIDO, but essentially the story was ILO and UNCTAD. UNCTAD being very concerned with the costs of technology transfer, ILO being very concerned about the choice of technology and employment and income distribution.
You mentioned earlier that at that time, there was a big concentration of technology and technological capabilities in high-income countries. I think you mentioned something like 97% of R&D was. The landscape started changing quite rapidly, and then the global south started developing technological capabilities, domestic technological capabilities, and there was a whole literature around capabilities that was linked to that at that time. The work of Sanjay Lal and others becomes very visible at that point. How does your work connect to the work of other contemporary scholars? Yes, was there a consensus? Were there complementarities in the approaches? How did you situate your work within that?
So the historical roots to the discussion on capabilities has two main avenues, I think. The first one was the recognition of the success of Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and Korea, and subsequently of China. And that was the story of the participation of these countries as major exporters. And it very evidently being the case. I remember when they first entered the world market, Brian Van Arcady and Jerry Heliner started working on those issues. And rather disparagingly, Brian Van Arcady dismissed the Taiwanese story as being the export of women's hair. One of the major exports of Taiwan in the early year was for wigs in the rich countries. And so the first reaction, particularly of those people on the left, was to dismiss this as a figment of economic orthodoxy. But I think the growing success of these countries made it quite evident that something has been happening in these countries. The World Bank and the Washington Consensus saw it all as being a response to the dominance of market forces and neglected the many decades of import substitute industrialization. They were very dismissive of inward-oriented industrialization. But of course, outward-oriented industrialization would never have occurred without that. So that's one avenue of recognition of capabilities. The other one, Erika, where you were involved, Martin Bell played a key role, and of course, Sanjay Lal was a critical part of that story. And subsequently, people like Bengt Torkel Lundvall and others began to document the growth of capabilities in developing countries. I think your research was on that. That's right, Erika, you worked with Sanjay Lal on that, which was working at the micro level just to see the extent to which capabilities were being built up in developing countries. And it surfaces now, if I can, I don't want to throw statistics at this audience, but if you think of capabilities being reflected in capital goods production, that is equipment and machinery, if you look at the share of Africa, Latin America, and much of Asia's imports of machinery and equipment, and ask the question, where does it come from? In the year 2000, the answer was virtually nothing came from China. By 2015, a third of all of the imports of capital goods in these continents came from China. So there's been a massive, massive growth of capabilities in developing countries. And I'm sure we'll get to that later. I think that has considerable significance to how developing countries might develop in the future, using technology coming from other developing countries rather than solely from the rich world.
Do you think the whole discussion around technology choices, appropriate technologies, technological capabilities has evolved as quickly as the reality in developing countries? Or do you think we are still using kind of outdated frames for a very fast-moving new reality?
Why don't you take the question mark away from that statement? Of course, during the 1970s and 1980s, much of the elite, particularly in Africa, saw appropriate technology. They were very dismissive about it. It was the West's attempt to consign Africa to low levels of production and to inhibit them from developing. So I think it's still the case that the phrase appropriate technology is a disparaging phrase. And most people will turn their noses up and say appropriate technology is really rubbish. Depends what you mean, but I have absolutely no doubt that there are now different, much wider choice of technology available. and they provide much more scope for different trajectories of development. And that's not just an issue for the developing countries, it's also an issue in the rich countries as well. We don't have to only go one technological route. There are many alternatives, and we can shape those alternatives.
Okay, I'm going to move to another area, related area of work, where you have produced a lot of knowledge. It's your work related to globalization dynamics, which sort of spans in different ways. But here I would like to ask you about two areas of work that you've led. One of them is your work around global value chains, and the other one is the dynamics of Asia, in particularly China, and its role in the world economy. So starting with the first one, you've been a main contributor to developing the ideas around global value chains. It is a widely used and very powerful analytical tool to look at the world and to understand how production is fragmented across the world, but also the power dynamics governing this change. Can you tell us a little bit about your central contributions in this work, and perhaps link to that question? What is your view about how studies in this area have evolved from the origins until now?
Okay, can I take that in 4 bites, Erika? And I'll try to have a gap in between them, because otherwise it will just be a monologue. The scales, if there were any scales, were pulled away from my eyes in the late 1980s when I was working in the Dominican Republic. I was responsible for leading a series of teams looking at industrial and technology policy in the Dominican Republic. And they saw their route to the future as export processing zones. And I remember working with a factory manufacturing jeans, I believe it was for Nike, but it doesn't really matter, which invested a considerable amount of money by their standards in making jeans with a guaranteed order from Nike, if it was Nike, let's say it was. And after 3 months, Nike came along and said, you remember that order for those jeans when we offered to pay you $2.05 per jean? We're not going to do that anymore. We'll give you $1.97. 3 months later, came back and said, do you remember the $1.97 we were going to pay you for each jean? We'll do it $1.91. And gradually, the price they offered the Dominican Republic kept on falling. And the amount of jeans they were taking from the DR were falling as well. And after 15 months, the contract was terminated. And what had happened was that the Dominican Republic were merely assembling materials brought in from all over the world. They were doing nothing else but just sewing things together and putting them in boxes. And they were able to compete because their wages were low. Our friends in the World Bank went round to neighboring economies and they said, look how well the DR is doing on jeans. Why don't you do the same thing? You know what, if you devalue, your wages will be lower than the Dominican Republic. So Honduras devalued. And then the World Bank went to Nicaragua and said, look at Honduras and the Dominican Republic. Why don't you devalue your currency and your wages will be even lower? So we had a race to the bottom, inspired by the policy of the Washington Consensus, inducing countries to reduce their wages through competitive devaluations. And from that, the realization came to me that the issue was not whether to participate in the global economy, but how to participate in the global economy. So if you don't participate effectively, you have immiserizing growth, more and more economic activity with lower and lower standards of living. And the issue then was how to escape that trap of immiserization. And here the answer is one, of course, of what the value chains literature calls upgrading and what innovations literature calls innovation, to develop an offering which is more than just sewing jeans together. So you asked about my views on globalization and how I got to it. The first one was the recognition that the low wage route to economic growth in the context of a large global labor force was not the answer. Second bite, in the late 1970s, with my colleagues at IDS, we stumbled across the work of Raphie, who is the seminal name in value chains. Gary ran a program called the Global Commodity Chains from World Systems Analysis, which was documenting the global spatial division of labor, who was doing what in the world. And when we got together, the IDS group and the Gary's group, we shifted the debate away from just mapping the geographical location of production and competitiveness to what we called global value chains, which is who gained from global value chain literature. So we had a very fruitful program which brought in a number of people, Duke University, MIT in the US, people in India, colleagues in Africa, South Africa, not just South Africa, also East Africa, of course, in Europe and IDS. This was a classic globally networked program which explored not just the spatial division of labor in global production, but also the gains, who gained and who lost. Which takes me to the third part of that story, which is the role of standards, and which is now called ESG. What about labor standards? Did they make a difference if you had labor standards or you had environmental standards? What did that do to the beneficiaries of participation in global value chains? And we'll talk about that later on, I'm sure, but some people gained, those who had the capabilities to be in standards intensive production gained, but others didn't and were excluded. The informal sector, Erika, I know your area as well. And then very finally, in this monologue, in my recent book on sustainable agendas, globalization becomes an important part of the story. Because if we look at Carlotta and Chris's work on long waves and the fact that long waves degrade, before the mass production long waves, each of the waves lasted 60, 70 years. Mass production lasted much longer. And what I've tried to do in my book on sustainable agendas is to explain why the longevity of global value chains, how it was extended through globalization. When the crisis of productivity occurred in mass production from the mid-1970s onwards, and the rate of profit began to fall in the rich countries in the corporate sector, in normal circumstances, that would have led to a new phase of innovation, the ICT revolution. But the corporate sector was able to avoid that by taking advantage of cheap labor. It was able to revive profitability by exploiting cheap labor rather than by a new round of innovation. And here we see the link between what happens in the corporate sector, as it were, the workings of capitalism, and the macro expression in global policy, because that transition to cheap labor in developing countries, of course, was the Washington Consensus. And it was the death of industrial policy as the instruments of global capitalism, the World IMF, the World Bank, the bilateral aid agencies, went to developing countries. And for many of them, they were forced to reduce controls on imports and were forced to become export-oriented, and in so doing, helped create the environment in which export-oriented growth became successful, and the mass production long wave had an extended life. Now expiring, of course.
So this is sorry, I know that I need to move on to other questions, but I really want to ask you about the global value chain literature focuses very much on what firms do. I mean, the studies that have emerged, and it seems like and this is my own interpretation, that the connection between, I mean, what are the implications in terms of innovation policy? What is that relationship between what happens in firms and the corporate sector and governments and the policy sector? And that in that light, what do you think are the main takeouts that the literature, particularly in developing countries, needs to pay attention to derive the right policy approaches to manage global value chains in ways that don't lead to immisering growth?
So unfortunately, we operate in silos in the world. some of those silos are disciplinary silos, and I don't want to talk about that for the moment. But there are two big takes on this in development. The one is innovation studies literature, and the other take is the upgrading literature in global value chains. They're essentially talking about the same issue, how to escape immiserizing growth, although innovation literature is more focused on the formal R&D part of that story. So Bentorke Lundvall and Chris Freeman and Charles Edquist and others have looked at national systems of innovation, regional systems of innovation, sectoral systems of innovation, which is what can governments do by bringing into the story research institutions, educational institutions, getting them to work on specific targeted areas of innovation together with the local firms, and so that the policy agenda there is essentially agenda around the science and technology system. The global value chains take on this works at the level of the firm, which says if the firm only confines itself to the assembly of materials in chains which are defined and governed by others, they will be competing only on the basis of cheap labor. So the big ask then for firms in global value chains is to upgrade. How do we upgrade? By producing new products? How do we upgrade? By changing our processes? How do we upgrade? By changing what we do in the chain, that is not just assembling, but beginning the process of design, beginning the process of marketing and retail. And Justina, you were talking earlier on about the Globelix meeting in Accra. It must have been 6 or 7 years ago, when I made a plea for the innovation studies literature to engage more centrally with the global value chains literature. And I think it's begun to happen now. It took too long. The two communities are working in similar areas and should be collaborating much more closely. And I think Rasmus Lehmer's group and Roberta's group are beginning to do that, and we're beginning to close that gap between those two silos.
Great. I want to move to the next area related to globalization, the dynamics of globalization, where you looked particularly at the rise of China or Asia, especially China, and its global presence and its impact in developing countries, especially Africa. You developed a large body of work around that, and there was a big program looking at this, the Asian Drivers Program. And here, maybe I can ask you a bit more about what you mentioned at the very beginning, the collective production of knowledge. What does it mean for pushing the boundaries of the theoretical tools that we use, for the methodologies that we use? What does it mean in a large program to collaborate and to try and bring in different bodies of knowledge to answer a very complex question and very complex dynamics such as this?
Thanks. So we live in a rapidly changing world, and I hope one of the messages which I'm bringing over is that dynamic capabilities in our own research agenda is important as dynamic capabilities as the level of the firm. So between 1999 and 2005, 2006 was a very rich and flourishing period of a globally networked research program focusing on value chains, particularly moving to the idea of looking at the distributional outcomes of global production networks. In about 2004, 2005, it became increasingly obvious that the central player in the story was China. And we then began to ask the question, what was the impact of China in the world? So it started off as the impact of China on the world. And then Khalid Nabi, we owe credit to him for this phrase. We tried at the beginning, and I think subsequently failed to describe this as a program not just of the impact of China on the world, because China was one of a number of developing countries which were developing these capabilities and this large footprint. And we called it Asian Drivers, thinking then of China, India, and the East Asian countries, knowing that, of course, Brazil and other developing countries would in future years also become big participants in the global value chain. in some sense, it was a fortunate phrase, Asian drivers, but many people came back to us afterwards and said when they Googled Asian drivers, what came up was Afghan taxi drivers in New York. Did we really want to keep using the phrase Asian drivers? But anyway, be that as may, we started again a matching global network program on the impact of Asian drivers, which I'm afraid degraded into a story of China's impact on the world. Mike Morris, who's one of the participants here, myself, went to the African Economic Research Consortium, must have been in 2007, and said, we'd like to talk to you about a program working on China and Africa. There were two Nigerians there we became very close to in later years, who looked at us and said, oh, you damn South Africans, our problem in Africa isn't these China in Africa, it's you predatory South Africans. But as things began to unravel, so they came to realize that the story of China and China's, and we'll talk about that perhaps later on, China's impact on Africa was very, very substantial. Now, China's impact has a number of dimensions to it, and our program developed two by two distinctions, which I think was very helpful. The first one was that China's impact could be both complementary and competitive. It could be an aid to developing countries, but it could also be destructive, and particularly destructive on manufacturing capabilities in developing countries. But secondly, China's impact could both be direct, that is Africa's trade with China, and it could be indirect, that is China's trade with Europe had an impact on Africa, which may be, and in fact was, more significant than China's direct impact on Africa. And that surfaced most significantly in the case of the global price of commodities. And between 2002 and 2014, and I believe now in the future, we had a historically significant change in the terms of trade between the prices of commodities and the price of manufacturers. For those of you steeped in the development literature, you will know that the Singer-Prebisch hypothesis was that the price of commodities would always fall compared to the price of manufacturers, and that developing countries should therefore get out of commodities and move into manufacturers. And with China's advent as a global powerhouse of industry, the price of manufacturers was falling, and yet the demand for commodities in China and other developing countries meant that the price of commodities was increasing. So what was assumed to be a natural order of events of the declining terms of trade against commodities in developing countries had to be rethought. So for some years, and again, I worked with a group of researchers, and the collective work is always more interesting than the individual work. We worked with a large program of African researchers looking at the extent of commodity linkages from the commodity sector in Africa. Was it true that there was very little contribution from commodities production to the domestic economy? Was there scope for linkages to be built between the commodity sectors and local industry? And if so, what were the policy implications? And that then became making the most of the commodities program, which not just researched this in 9 or 10 African countries, but as in all these cases, played a leading role in capability building and building skills among a whole cadre of young African researchers who've subsequently become very influential.
Can I ask you, Raphie, if I need to try and get the 2 or 3 key findings from that work that you've done on China and Asia and the impact in the world economy that are still relevant today? If you say these are the 2 or 3 things that we found that are still relevant today, what would that be?
Still and increasingly relevant, right?
Yes.
The first is the erosion of the hegemony of one, of a single way of doing things, which is the Washington Consensus and the domination of the global economy by the US and Western countries. And I think, as we're seeing worked out in the most tragic ways at the moment in Ukraine, the global hegemony of the West, or the Northern European countries and the US is being eroded. And I think that's of significant historical importance. The second one, I think, and Erika, your own work is important in this, is it opens up the possibility of a different trajectory of growth and development. And I think we need to put that together with the collapse of mass production, which Carlotta has done a lot of work on. That really, the old system doesn't work. And the old system was a form of production that didn't work. It had geopolitical expressions, the neoliberal agenda, the Washington consensus, which don't work as well. So to reduce a complex story, you asked for a limited number of implications. I would say the erosion of the neoliberal free market agenda, the anti-statist agenda, the erosion of the dominance of a single way of doing things, mass production, and the opening up of the possibilities for new trajectories of growth and development. And I want to emphasize not just in the developing countries, because if it's needed anywhere, of course, it's needed at the center of the world economy as well. There's not just one way forward. There are many ways forward, and we have to work at that. They don't happen by accident. Directionality becomes really important, and I'm sure we'll get to that issue as well.
Great. I'm looking at time, so, and there are a couple of things that I have a couple of questions that I really want to go through. So let me move to the next one. You've recently focused on sustainability. You mentioned your latest book, Sustainable Futures: An Agenda for Action, that was published last year. It may seem like a recent preoccupation, but when I looked at your publications, I saw that back in the 1990s, you were already talking about sustainability, and even green industrialization just over 10 years ago. And I have two related questions here. One is that when I look at your contributions over time, you seem to have raised some of the key themes or preoccupations at an early stage. For instance, sustainability, you were talking about that very early on. Electronics and ICTs was also an issue that sort of was there in your early literature. And then you seem to dip in and out of these topics. And now sustainability is at the center of your latest academic work. So what makes you put environmental sustainability at the center of your research at the moment? And second, what makes you sort of go back to bring back some issues that you saw important several years ago that may emerge again? Is it sort of you see that these are unresolved issues? They keep you up at night one day and you come back and think about ICTs as a key issue again. What is it? What makes you come back to topics, and why sustainability now?
Erika, most of the people participating in this discussion see themselves as being innovation scholars, I guess. And I feel I would like to challenge the way in which our professions push us into rather narrow areas, into silos, so that you're in innovation studies and you stay in innovation studies. And I think none of us should be seeing, I believe, since we're also social actors, none of us should be seeing our contributions within a particular subject area. Our job is to try and understand big processes of what creates more acceptable environmentally, socially, and political livelihoods and the world around us. So for most people, if you say sustainability, think, the environment. No, it's not just the environment. And in my book, what I've tried to do is to think of three realms of sustainability. There's the environmental sustainability. There's economic sustainability. That is, can the system continue to expand and grow? And there's political sustainability. Are our political systems robust? And do they continue to function in a way which is in some way legitimate in their communities? And I would say that in one way or another, since I began working in the early 1970s, I've been flitting in and out of these three realms of sustainability. We have to have things which are economically sustainable, which help us to solve the problems of global poverty. We want to have a world which is more socially sustainable, which is more equitable, where people feel they belong and participate. And we have to have a world which is more environmentally sustainable. So at the end of my career, although I hope I'm not going to die quite that soon, at the end of my career, I tried to bring sustainability back as an integrated topic, looking at all these elements of sustainability. And again, Carlotta, you of course take a lot of credit for this, initially with Chris and now with you. There's a framework for, not just for thinking about the interlinks between social, economic, and environmental sustainability, but seeing that you cannot understand them as separate issues. And I believe the socio-technical paradigm provides an integrating analytical framework. And I don't just mean analytical because it's clever analytically, but it's essential. That's the way the system works. And unless we understand the way they co-evolve, the way the environment and the economy co-evolve, the way society and the economy co-evolve, unless we understand those interrelationships and links, we won't be able to make the world a better place. So what I was doing in the early 1970s was choice of technology. In the 1980s on beginning of electronics systems, the 1990s on industrial policy, the 2000s of global value chains, then China. They all appear to be separate topics, but they're not separate topics. In each of these, I was necessarily required to seek for a way of understanding how these three areas interrelate and co-evolve.
So what you're telling us is don't lose sight of the bigger picture, right?
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, and of course, there are methodological implications for that as well. I think we push too many of our young students into very, very detailed micro work. That's not bad, but when the micro work is sitting in front of computers, throwing complex statistical techniques at very large databases of uncertain provenance, I think we're not doing much to help understand the world and make it a better place.
Maybe let's, in the last couple of minutes, I would like to take that as the lead for the final question, which is, I mean, you mentioned many important points now that you know we could follow up on, you know, in terms of theoretical integration and where the field should go on, you know, in terms of bringing different theoretical tools together. But perhaps let me use this couple of minutes to ask you to give a few words for the young emerging scholars in this field. We started off by talking about your political activism in South Africa and how that has shaped to a large extent the way in which you have chosen certain topics and certain types of engagements with the policy community, but also with other stakeholders. What areas or types of research or modalities of research would you encourage the new generations to focus on to take the field of, you know, to take innovation studies where we would like it having a larger impact in society?
So I think the central observation, which surely we all have in the community involved in this discussion, is that we believe we want to make the world a better place. And I think since this community finds its roots in Chris Freeman, that was Chris's central concern in life. He was not just an analyst of the world, he also saw himself as an activist and a participant. So I would say to younger researchers, you need to know why you're doing this. And yes, it's intellectually exciting, and yes, it gives you a career and a profession. But ultimately, we're all social actors, and we want to make the world more sustainable in the wide sense in which I've described sustainability. That being the case, the research you do must necessarily involve you in interacting in the world around you. And so you need to, Erika, I take your question really being around a mentoring point for younger researchers, is that right? So therefore, if you're going to do that, you have to interact with your subject matter. You can only understand what's happening in innovation area or the sustainability area by speaking to the people who are actively involved in working in the world. So that means research must also involve practical research in working with people in the real world. And then you have to have a sense of humility. As researchers, we are of course trying to understand what you're doing, and we can provide insights into helping you as civil society actors or as firms or as governments do your jobs more effectively. But actually this is a two-way learning process. And I think my understanding of what industrial policy now has become is a central part of that story. We used to see industrial policy and policy in general as writing very informed, empirically informed documents, usually with glossy covers, lots of figures and graphs inside. If we were really enterprising, we would have the occasional cartoon, but they would be presented to a government and say, here's your industrial strategy. And we now see industrial strategy as a process in which people work together and the paperwork becomes rather less important. I think John Besant is with us at the moment. And John, I don't know if you remember, we were working on industrial strategy in Kazakhstan in the very early days of transition, must have been in 1989, 1990, sitting in a room with a long table, everybody dressed in suits. We were part of a European community advisory program. And the minister said, welcome, Professor Kaplinsky. We're very keen to have your team to help us write you on our industrial strategy. We're very grateful. I'm sure we will live to thank you for the wonderful input you've made. And it was one of those moments when as an actor, you make a key decision. Am I going to take a risk to try and move things forward, or am I going to not? And I took the risk and I closed my book and I said, thank you very much, Minister. I'm grateful for your generous words, but I'm afraid you've got the wrong people. We're not the right people. We don't write industrial strategies for anybody. And I'm sure there are people who do that in the consulting world, but we're not the right people. If you want to do your industrial strategy and you would like us to help you on your journey, we'd be delighted to join you, but we don't write your industrial strategy for you. And in fact, our intervention in Kazakhstan at the time was the longest lived intervention of foreign advisors between, I would say, 1990 and the late 1990s, early 90 and the late 1990s, because our approach essentially was one of working together and not seeing this as a process expressed in paper and reports, but as a process expressed in a series of actions designed to change the world.
Raphie, thanks so much for this conversation. We have reached the o'clock time, so I promise to be diligent with time, and I think I will put the stop to this segment of the conversation now. But I mean, I think it's been extremely enlightening. I think we have tried to summarize about 50 years of academic contributions in about 45 minutes, which is obviously impossible. But I hope it's given a little bit of a flavor of the work that Raphie's done. Despite your humility and despite the fact that you have emphasized that a lot of your work has been done collectively, we are also able to see the magnitude of your own contribution to the field and to mentoring others and pretty much, you know, setting up the key tracks that others have followed in the literature. So I think it's been great talking to you, and I'm looking forward to the second part of this discussion. I'll pass it back to Justina.
Thank you very much, Erika, and thank you for such an engaging discussion. It's really been very interesting. And I know that the next session is equally going to be another level. So we want to go for a 5-minute break. But before we go on a break, I have just 2 quick announcements to make. The first is to remind all of us, especially those who participated in the IS 102 series, to send in their evaluation. I think Chris has sent emails to every one of us who participated in the last series of the lectures. So the Christopher Freeman 102 series, if you know you participated, kindly fill in the evaluation, which is really good for the organizers to track how well they've performed. And our second announcement is also to announce that for the next session of the In Conversation series, the series 4, we are going to have Judith Sooth with Smita Srinivas. And then it's going to be in April. The date is not really confirmed yet. So we would announce it soon. So just keep glued to the Chris network and then you will be informed. Thank you very much. We'll just have a 5-minute break. We'll come back and then the rest of the panelists will take over. And I think Carlota will start and then followed by the rest. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I think we'd like to resume for the next session to continue. So at this point, I'll invite Erika once again to lead the discussion by calling out the panelists to also make their contribution to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Justina, and welcome back, everybody. So we, unfortunately, one of our discussants is not able to join. Norman Clark is not able to join, but we have two professors that I'm sure will keep a lot of the discussion going. So, we will start with Mike Morris. Mike Morris is an emeritus professor at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and he's worked with Raphie for 25 years. Mike, the floor is yours.
When I was asked by Erika if I would like to participate in this, I said that I would really love to do it, but it also would be an honor. And the reason is that it gives me a chance to say thank you to Raphie for 25 years of working together, of being extremely generous. It's true what he says about collegiality, but it works the other way mostly. He's extremely generous as a colleague. And I found that in all the time I've worked with him, that it's been a really rewarding intellectual experience. And so this gives me my moment to publicly say this to you, Raphie. Thank you very, very much. We worked for 25 years. I did a count the other day. We produced 19 journal publications together, 5 chapters in books, 1 book, and then the Handbook of Global Value Chains, which we just put on the web. If we had published it, we'd be rich by now, since the number of times it's been cited is ridiculous. It's very hard to have this discussion because I've been with you in a journey for such a long time. And what I thought was, I thought I'd try and discuss it in a particular way. The problem is I also discussed it with you over the last few days. So you said a lot of the things that I wanted to say. So I hope I'm not going to repeat too much. But I did think that the best way, if it's helpful, to open a discussion is to say that it seems to me that in the work that we've done together, which has been about innovation, but not really about the way innovation studies has focused things. It's been about innovation, but it seems to me that throughout that time, there are about 5 themes that have characterized your work. And I'd like to put them to you. And then, I hope you'll agree with me that you've been concerned always with firm innovation, which is micro studies. And you call that competitiveness, world-class manufacturing. And how firms can move into a situation in the developing world where they're able to compete better and move, I won't use the word up the value chain, but they're able to deal with and integrate into their production activities ways of being more productive. You've also been incredibly concerned with another theme, which is globalization and the opportunities that this brings for the distribution of gains between firms, and that you called rents. So there's a whole pile of work which is around the distribution of rents. And also who gains in terms of what are the social gains, and that we call inclusion nowadays. So it was present for a long time, I think, and that theme has been consistent and running throughout your work. I think there is another theme that's been critically important, which has been value added, that firms have to create additional value in order to be able to be sustainable. And that's your Dominican Republic story. It clearly comes from there. But I think that it's exactly what you gave to us in the global value chain literature. By shifting the discussion from global commodity chains to global value chains, immediately that enabled us to sort of look at the whole question of upgrading and value addition of links in the chain. And that's a critical theme that's been running through your work. This led to, I think, this whole question of the impact of China, because did China help firms in Africa in terms of value addition? or did it maintain firms, in Africa in negative spaces? We phrased this as, was China the savior or was it the curse, for African industrialization? But you took that further and you asked the question about the technological implications of Chinese development, and whether what seemed to us to be cheap technologies were actually much more appropriate and much more helpful. So as always, this issue of this impact of China was done with broad brushstrokes. And I think that's one of the other themes that have run through your work. And then finally, there's the question of power policy and the state. And the question I have to pose to you is, I think this has been undercooked in the work, that you've done. And I'd like to ask you about, to open up a discussion around that. I'm not trying to be critical, but I think that it's a gap that I feel in all the work, at least the work we have done together, except recently. And I wonder whether that's an issue that you'd like to focus on. The last thing I want to say is that you've never worked in silos. You worked with these themes that sort of flow through your work. And would I be correct to say that at certain times, the one theme rises to the fore? It's like a swell of the waves. And then another theme in another time period in different work comes to the fore. So it's not a case that you worked on one thing and then you move to another thing and you move to another thing. There are these themes that rise, that flow into each other, that are like different colors in a blanket. And you see different themes at different points in time. Would that characterize your work adequately?
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the positive words as well. Erika, this takes me back to a conversation with you earlier on, which is about what are we saying to the younger generation of scholars, which is of any assistance. And I was fortunate enough to be an academic when the world was an easy place to be an academic in. We could choose what we wanted to study. We weren't being monitored and evaluated as closely as we are at the moment. And we weren't caught in these fetters of what constitutes a discipline. So if you go back to the point you made about the themes in my work, Mike, and me flitting in and out and being like a blanket woven with different colors, that was the intellectually exciting part of my life. And it was the privilege that I had to be able to do that. I fear that younger people will find that much more difficult. I fear that younger people find that much more difficult. I don't have to apply for grants. I don't have to sit through research assessment framework. I don't have to have X articles published every year. I mean, I once decided with somebody who now works for UNCTAD, we'd submit an article to the Economic Journal, which was on the price performance of Chinese products in global markets. She was a really hot econometrician. I asked the general questions. We did a project which took us 2 or 3 years. You had to join the Royal Economic Society for at least 6 months before you can submit a paper to the Economic Journal. So we handed it round to one of our colleagues at the IDS, Adrian Wood, who said, half jokingly, this isn't economics, there are only 13 equations in the article. So, you're describing a world, Mike, where I've been able to move in and out of these areas, which has been a privilege, but also is essential to understand the world. And I don't begin to understand how young people can negotiate their careers around those issues. The second point you raised is autocritique by me of basically where am I deficient and where I've gone wrong in many respects, right? But in my recent book, which I regard really as the culmination of what I've been thinking over the years, I have 5 major policy takeaways. The first one is to do something about reorienting the financial sector away from gambling and speculation to reinforcing the real economy, particularly the green economy. The second one is to do something about the power of the plutocracy to define the political and and policy agendas, and that necessarily involves a redistribution of income. And that's the how question, which I'm never able to answer. How the hell do we now think we're going to be able to do that? What are the politics of making the big political decisions which are required to change the world? Erika, you and myself work on this question of marginalization. For those who don't know Erika's numbers, if you look outside of agriculture, in Africa, most of Asia and Latin America, more than 2/3 of the population earn their livelihoods in the informal sector. All of our policy advice, virtually all of our policy advice, is directed to the formal sector, because these are the people who hold the reins of power. So I think, and I don't have an answer, Erika, you began by asking me about my political background in South Africa, and what did that do to my worldview at the moment? It's how do we engage with politics and power? I know, Carlotta, I see you on the screen, you're essentially concerned with this, and I'm autocritical because I don't know the answer to that. But I'm unfairly autocritical because I don't believe any one of us know the answer to that. And nor do I think that there is necessarily an answer to it. So I think the unfinished part of my work, Mike, if that's what your question was essentially around, is really to understand issues of power, politics, and persuasion. And Carlotta, I'm looking at you on the screen now, because particularly with respect to the rich countries, I think you've got your mind around this question of how do we influence people to change? And I'm sure you're going to make some points on that score later on. I don't know whether that helps, Mike, or in any way meets your questions.
Well, I mean, I'll come back to it. There is a big question about the state and class. But the thing that struck me in thinking about this work that's I've been part of and been very grateful for being part of, is that the importance of export-oriented industrialization and of global value chains, and your Dominican Republic story, is that we had an optimistic view of the outcome of global value chains. As long as you upgraded, i.e. innovated, it's just a different word, as long as firms upgraded in global value chains, there was an optimistic alternative in terms of industrialization. And for the country as a whole, and in terms of income distribution, there was an optimistic alternative. So behind the global value chain story is a world where not everybody, but at least a significant part of the developing world upgrades and industrializes. But that, in terms of the way that you look at it, and I'll leave myself out now for the moment, but that story's changed. I mean, global value chains are fragmented. You may believe, and I'm never sure if you do believe it's the end of global value chains. I think that it's a shift in the way in which value chains operate. But what does this do now to our opportunity for an optimistic view with regard to industrialization from the perspective of developing countries and from the perspective of Africa?
So in short, I'm very skeptical about the sustainability of global value chains as we experience them after China entered the world economy in the mid-1980s. I just don't think it's going to happen. I think we're moving to a very, very different world. So the question then is, what happens to producers in developing countries who are exporting? And we can talk, I'm sure we'll talk about South-South trade and regional value chains. But again, my attention's now shifting back to Erika, because the power in the discussion, the work that I did with you, Mike, was really around power in value chains. I now feel the power we're talking about is power of a different order. We're talking about politics. We're talking about the real agenda for innovation trajectories. Does not lie so much in the innovation trajectories within firms, within chains, but it's a story about broader political issues and the overwhelming importance of politics. Erika, I know we're running out of time, or Justina, but I do want to just talk to a vignette of work which John Besant and myself and Mike did in South Africa. Mike, you will remember, John, you'll remember, we were looking at a firm which was painting fenders, bumpers of motor cars. And the big problem was that dust was getting under the paint, and they were having to rework the fenders of all the cars. And we were, all the fenders they were painting. And the management came to us with a series of high-tech solutions. And eventually a supervisor came into the story and he said, "You want me to tell you how to get rid of the dust from under the number plates? I'm working in a tunnel which is putting paint on the fenders. And they don't trust me doing what I'm doing. So my supervisor keeps on coming in to find out whether I'm doing my job properly. Every time he comes in, he opens the flap of the painting room, more dust gets inside, and our fenders get damaged. Tell him to go away, right? Tell him to trust me, to give me the power to make those decisions myself, and I will give you fenders with no dust underneath." And indeed, that was the case. Now, it's an amusing anecdote, but it really emphasizes that the story of power, of empowerment, is really critical right the way through the development agenda. That's an example at the minutest scale of the story. But we have to really problematize the nature and expression of power right through the system if we are to understand the innovation story. And most of the people in this conversation are innovation scholars. And my plea really is to move out of narrowness in innovation inquiry into issues of power and politics, in the firm, of course, as well as in society at large.
Erika, have I got a few more minutes? So, you see, that's the interesting question, for me, because I do remember that very clearly. I mean, the guy said, I come from the posting from hell, if you remember, the manager who told us that story. And he didn't know what to do when he asked his workers. And because he asked his workers what he was supposed to do, because he had to answer these clever professors, he said he came up with this as a solution. So that in itself, reinforces your point. It was not only, it was about trusting the workers in the firm. The problem is that that's at the micro level. The issue for me is, what does this all mean now in a changing global world at the political level of the state? And one answer to this is that, what we need is a strong developmental state that will operate and be able to incorporate knowledge and activities to help firms to be able to industrialize. And that's the way we'll deal with the fracturing of global value chains. But I don't think that's pie in the sky, Raphie, in terms of Africa, and therefore I'm left once again with wondering, what are the broader political relationships that are required if we're going to have industrialization in Africa in this very changing world, globalized world we live in now?
Okay, unfortunately, the two faces on the screen, Venezuela and South Africa, both speak to the state as being the problem, not the solution. And the concern there is that you default into a neoliberal view, which is to get rid of all government. And we cannot get rid of all government. The government's absolutely critical. The question is, what is the nature of that government and the nature of the state apparatus? And as I say, unfortunately, we've got two, perhaps the worst examples of government in this conversation.
I think this is a good sequel to our next discussion. Even though I see that there's a lot to discuss here, and hopefully Carlota would be able to pick up on some of these issues about the role of the state. Let me introduce you very briefly. I think Carlota Perez is known by everyone in this forum. She's an honorary professor at SPRU and honorary professor at UCL. among other affiliations, but and leading thinker in the innovation studies. So Carlota, the floor is yours.
Well, I want to begin by agreeing with Mike that Raphie is one of the most generous colleagues I've ever known. I have been very lucky because I had Chris Freeman, Robin Murray, and I now have Raphie and also Slavoj Radosevic, who are very close to me after I've lost the previous ones. And frankly, Raphie has been fantastic, a fantastic colleague, fantastic collaborator, and also somebody who shares my worry about the world and about development and about the type of knowledge we have to produce. I'm also very worried about what the young are being taught by this physics MB world and by the refereeing and all this. So I just wanted to begin by confirming that we agree fully on that issue and that I'm very grateful to have Raphie as a colleague. I wanted Raphie to ask you a question, to tell me the truth. One of the virtues of your last book, Sustainable Futures, is that it first gives us a thorough analysis of how we got to the crisis situation we're facing, economically, socially, environmentally, and so on. And then you make concrete proposals as to how to overcome the various crises. So the first part would paint you as a pessimist, and the second as an optimist. So which are you and why?
Phew. Why don't we end this discussion 5 minutes ago, Erika? Let me say, on my book, I will just repeat the 5 policy agendas which I identify. The first one is reorienting the financial sector, getting them to put money into particularly the greening of the economy and to stop this mad arbitrage and speculation, which just fuels increasing inequality and short-termism in our societies. I believe an economic crisis has the potential to erode the financial basis of some of these people. If we are going to go into a big global macroeconomic crisis, which I think is possible, probable, hopefully some of them will come with money. The second agenda is to do something, as I've said, about changing the political agenda. The idea that we mustn't give social security to poor people. If we give social security to poor people, it will take away the incentive to work. But you know what? We shouldn't tax the rich people, because if you tax the rich people, it will reduce their incentive to work. So somehow giving money to poor people is bad because it takes away the incentive to work. But giving money to rich people, of course, is good because it makes them work hard. And that is now accepted as common sense and wisdom. And it's a complete nonsense. It's a complete nonsense. And it's an example of the way in which all of our agendas, our social agendas, have been written in a way to justify the continued control of society by the rich. And I think that that's the second policy agenda. And fake news, Cambridge Analytica, Murdoch News International, the Koch brothers in America, and I've documented that in the book. The way in which they control the political agendas is a second one. The third one is smart green growth. That is a greening agenda which takes advantage of the potential of electronics. And frankly, I don't think that's a problem. I think it is no longer the case that green growth is a cost, and it's increasingly the case that green growth is the opportunity. And one of the unfortunate, perverse, and tragic consequences of what we're seeing acted out in Ukraine at the moment is that, in fact, it's going to give an enormous potential, not in the short term, but it's going to be an enormous potential in the medium and long term for renewable energy and for better use of energy. The fourth agenda which I identify is the move towards more localism within countries and more global governance between countries. And I think we're making progress on both those fronts. On global governance, we're beginning to get a handle on tax avoidance. And we're beginning to at least problematize the issues for the governance of the global physical environment. Within countries, I think, certainly in the country I'm living in at the moment in the UK, we are seeing the growing power of localism as the state has been eroded at the national level by the neoliberals. Certainly in my community where I live, we're seeing more and more local government, local action, spontaneous, as well as also designed. And the fifth policy agenda is that global development is good for everyone, including people in the rich countries, not just for people in the poor countries. You can't solve the environmental problem if you don't solve the energy problem in developing countries. And as we move to automation in the rich countries, there's more and more people displaced from work, the poor countries become an increasing market as well. So, Carlotta, I'm sorry it's a long answer, but those are the 5 agendas we have, right? Now, I believe some are already happening. In cases, I've tried to identify where there are things that we can do, but others are just very, very difficult. And what do? Do we throw up our hands and say the rich are so powerful, there's no point? Or do we say, you know, it's our responsibility to try and work at this the whole time? And to use the phrase, which is, the content is not unique to Mariana Mazzucato, but the phrase directionality is Mariana's phrase. I think in the innovation and the political story, our responsibility is to help impart directionality. And directionality in a way, and I'm going to round off now, which tackles the sustainability issue, not just as an environmental issue, not just as an economic issue, and not just as a social issue. We have to see the interrelationships between the social, political, the economic, and the environmental. And it's hard, Carlotta. It's really hard. Do we have an alternative? Yes, you know, at the moment, things look very bleak. Things look very bleak because of the breakdown of the geopolitics of mass production and what's happening in Ukraine. But we have to continue as if it were possible. I believe it's possible, and it's hard, and it's not just a single bullet which will solve all these problems. We can eat away at the problems at the margin, and if enough of us do enough small things at the same time, as well as the big things, then I think we can actually make the world a more sustainable world.
Yes, I actually think that one of the terrible things about capitalism is that it never acts before the crisis. It's got to get so bad that they really, I mean, after a war or after, I just hope we're not going to wait until climate change has made us roast before acting. But I think that the things that are happening now are enough. And perhaps where we definitely agree is that it's all possible. It's all possible. The question if it's probable, and it has to do, of course, with finance being too global and disconnected. It has to do with politicians being too connected with finance and not being able to really, but they have to respond. In democratic countries, they have to respond, and even in authoritarian countries, they have programs that they have to, that makes them more stable. So I'd say that we have to be optimistic pessimists or pessimistic optimists. Now, Erika, do I have time to ask another question? Because there's...
Colin, can I just come back very briefly on that, although it
yes,
would be great to hear more about you. I think it's helpful to distinguish between the fetters and the blockers to change. The blockers to change are the people who will lose by change, and we have to find a way of confronting them. The fetter...
good point.
Yeah, the other group are the people, the blinkers. They just don't see change. And I think that's where we have a role to play. We can identify the areas where we have to confront people, but there are many people who just don't understand the issues. I know when we worked at the level of the firm, Mike and John Besant, I know, is here as well. You know, when you get people to change the way the firm is organized, they say, that's so obvious. Why didn't we do that before? I mean, we were mad. We went on doing things which were crazy. So I think that distinction between the blockers and the blinkers, fetters and the blinkers, sorry, is the metaphor I was searching for.
Good. Okay, well, my other question that comes to mind in relation to your latest book is about the developing world. Because, of course, your intense academic career has been centered on the developing world, the actions of major corporations, the great powers, the possibilities for development given those conditions. And the thing is that the current changes in the world stage, the continued advances of technology and the planetary crisis, all together seem to make the challenges for development even more daunting. Now, we have talked about this a lot, and we, of course, I know that we're both trying to look at this thing, but are you seeing new opportunities in the current circumstances? Which aspects would you say that are really new and that might make a difference, even different from what we saw in the 80s and 90s? Are there any things that you are seeing that open little windows of opportunity?
Okay, I'm going to identify three. And in this, I'm leaning on some work that Erika and myself have done, because the two of us have looked at this issue in exactly addressing the question you raised. But some of this also applies to the work I've done with Mike as well. So I think there are three real areas of opportunity. The first, less Erika and Mike, and more Chris Freeman, and perhaps Carlotta, is the potential which electronics have for leapfrogging the established technologies as a way of meeting the needs of social and economic and environmental development in the world. And, you know, there's so many examples of these, of the possibilities that are opened up by electronics. The one which is perhaps most evident and most widely documented is banking and finance, with M-Pesa, and where the developing countries have leapfrogged and led the way precisely because they didn't have the fixed telephone networks of the rich countries. They were able to take advantage of the power of the mobile phone. And that has morphed not just from money transfer, but also into solar power and energy regeneration, water in Tanzania. And for me, it seems to me the unexplored potential in the development agenda is with respect to agriculture, where most people earn their livelihoods. And I believe from the most simple and unsophisticated interventions like detailed intelligent weather forecasting, or answering the problems of farmers with respect to a particular type of plant disease where they can use their mobile phones to get advice, all the way through to transformative agriculture, which I'm working with in the UK, which is the use of highly automated farming systems. I think the potential offered by the new technology, ICTs, I call them a heartland technology, transformative technology, by comparison with mass production, really opens up so many possibilities, not just in production, but in healthcare, in virtually every area. So that's a major opportunity. But the truth is, it's been grasped. And with the low-level satellite telephone technologies which are coming out, broadband internet availability is going to be open to virtually everybody, everywhere in the world at very low cost. And we haven't begun to dream of the possibilities in the way in which these technologies can be used to enhance life. it has to be said that the same technologies can be used for surveillance and control, weaponry, and the most malign uses. So, the technology itself provides the potential. We have to give directionality to that potential. So that's opportunity number one. I now turn to the work I've done with Erika on the second opportunity, which is the very problematic sector, the informal sector, which is looked at so disparagingly by policymakers and analysts around the world. In the same way that appropriate technology was dismissed as being the plaything of rich country aid agencies, so the informal sector was always seen as a sector of marginalized, a residual category. People who couldn't earn a living anywhere else were thrown into informalization, lived in slums, died in slums, and had very little productive capability. It just doesn't capture the reality of the informal sector in an increasing number of countries, particularly with respect to increasingly educated younger people. And I know, Erika, you've done an awful lot of work on this, but I believe in the informal sector lies an enormous entrepreneurial potential. In Africa, which has a very, very large younger population, we talk about is it the generational dividend? What's it called, Erika? The youth dividend. Well, doesn't matter. The idea that we've got this massive labor force, which is a problem, right? If its needs aren't addressed, it becomes a political problem. But the dynamism, the capabilities, and the knowledge in particular political contexts, and that's the part I want to address, has enormous potential. So give electronics to people in the informal sector, and they will make use of it. There's a paper coming out of the German Development Institute, which is an extraordinary paper, and I'm going to make the numbers up. It's really the way in which informalized, young, educated people in Africa are entering the world service economy in quite extraordinary ways. There's something like, I think it's 15,000 Kenyans are employed in providing term papers and exam papers for students in rich countries. Who would have thought of that, right? People in the informal sector in a developing country writing essays and answers for kids in the rich countries. So that's an example of how this enormous potential exists and how that potential is harnessed. And that takes me back to the last point in the conversation with you, Mike, which is under what political dispensation we're going to be able to take advantage of and harness this fantastic creative potential of an increasingly educated young population. And unfortunately, our policy instruments are all aimed at and designed at the formal sector, the highly professionalized, long-term employed population in the urban areas and positions of power. So again, I don't believe we can address this issue as a technical issue or as an issue in innovation studies on its own. We have to look at the broader political dimensions of that. So that's the second positive one, Carlotta. The third one is South-South trade. I think as the mass production global economy as we know it atrophies and begins to collapse, so the agenda in developing countries moves away from engaging with rich countries, increasingly engaging with poor countries. And here I think there's potential at many, many different levels. But I want to go back to an example I raised earlier on, which is Chinese capital equipment in developing countries. So 3 of my PhD students, all Ghanaians when I was still properly employed, looked at the comparison between Chinese technologies and Western technologies in 3 basic sectors in 3 East African countries: clothing in Uganda, furniture in Kenya, and rice tilling in Tanzania. In each case, comparing the Chinese technologies with the Western technologies. The results were, in my view, and I don't believe we published it, I don't believe it's been adequately recognized in significance yet. In each case, the Chinese technologies were poor quality, right? They didn't produce as great a product. When you do the clothes and you have check clothes, it's important that the checks on the sleeve and the checks on the arm align so that they appear to be a common pattern. When you use Chinese sewing machines, you can't do that, right? It's very difficult. The clothes don't look the same. The seams may not be as robust. When you're making furniture in Kenya using Chinese machines, the machines may break down more often and they don't work to the same fineness, the same predictability of product as you did in highly automated factories. And when you look at rice tilling in Tanzania, the rice tilling machines break down the whole time. However, in each case, the cost of the Chinese technology and Indian technology was a fraction of the cost of the rich country technology. They were much more labor intensive. The very fact that they broke down, paradoxically, was an advantage. In Tanzania, the Chinese rice milling breaking down very often meant that you had the introduction of local repair shops right through the rural areas in Tanzania, beginning by repairing rice tilling machines, but then doing odd jobs across a range of other sectors. So I believe there's enormous potential in the appropriateness of Southern technology, and therefore not surprising that a third of the imports of capital goods in these three regions of the world now come from China. Add in India, Brazil, perhaps South Africa, perhaps Turkey, and you're talking of close to 40%. But the second one is when you're selling into high-income markets, the requirements of high-income consumers for the provenance of products, for the quality of products, means that you, in the value chain, are excluding a range of people who may not be very literate, who may not be very numerate, but who can't participate in these markets serving high-income consumers. And as South-South trade grows, as the final consumers are no longer necessarily people with high incomes, people prepared to tolerate less good products, I think there's more potential for inclusivity in regional value chains than there was in global value chains. But as in all these cases, there's a trade-off. That is, South-South rice tillers are environmentally bad. The noise is so great that people's hearing is affected, and they spill oil all over the fields. When you don't have ESG standards in value chains, you get child labor involved in producing in one developing country, selling into another country. So there's no magic bullet, but I believe this change in trajectory away from South-North to South-South has the potential for a more sustainable world in developing countries. What do you think?
Thanks for that. Oh, Carlota.
No, I absolutely agree with those three. I think they are very openings that are to be. I would add to that something that you didn't include, which is the possibility of rethinking the natural resource curse, to actually rethink, because we now have technologies that allow a whole range, the hyper-segmentation of markets, and we can have special materials, we can turn the materials economy into a high-tech economy and combine the things and turn each thing into a development project with institutional innovation and all these things. So that's a very complicated one and a very controversial one, but I would add number 4 to your
Erika,
list.
can I ask Carlotta another question?
Yes, please.
That's cheating.
A short one, yes.
Your big agenda now is dematerialization in the rich countries.
Yes.
We have to move to a world where the physical component of our consumption reduces. Otherwise, patently the world's. So what does that do to developing countries as producers of commodities?
Okay, I believe that one of the things we need to do to solve this whole thing, in my pessimistic, optimistic view, is that we need a supranational body, a regulator bank sort of thing, that will charge a global financial transactions tax, which might be higher if you're going into a tax haven. And with that money, then help green the developing world. But also we need to find a way of increasing the price of materials, but not through taxes in the advanced countries or through tariffs, but actually in a way that the extra money will go to the producers, to the developing world. So that has to be a form of cartel between producers and consumers with the purpose of greening the world economy. So it's a very difficult thing, but the things we did after the Second World War, those institutions were almost as difficult to conceive at the time as this one is difficult to conceive now. So let's talk about possible impossibilities. So if we could get that money to go to the producers of the materials, but to be in this bank so that you don't, so that it can only be used for greening. For greening the actual raw materials production also. That means using hydrogen for mining and all these other things. Then what would happen, and also, of course, technology so that you have special materials for special uses. What would happen is that because materials become more expensive gradually, we could also perhaps reduce the hypercycle thing by having these organizations. I know it's almost impossible to think, but impossibilities is what we need to do now, impossible things, because they're the only ones that will work. So if we can get prices of materials to be higher, we gain both things. On the one hand, we get producers in the north to use less and less materials because they're more expensive. We also need to move a lot of products from products to services. But of course, the whole energy thing, that every single one of our wind energy mills, windmills, requires something like 1.5 tons of concrete, because it's huge, it's enormous, and it's very heavy, and the wind is going to move them, so you have to hold it. Well, what do? Concrete is one of the most energy intensive things. So we're doing one thing, and so we have to find a way of turning the incredible amount of materials that are needed to green the economy to be less energy intensive. So the amount of innovation that has to go into the materials industries, into the mining industries, is going to be enormous. And that I think we have to participate in. And I think, at least I know the Latin American countries have capabilities, because during import substitution, we actually did a lot of processing technologies because we were raw materials producers. So the processing industries have there are capabilities in the processing industries that maybe we don't have in the fabricating industries. So anyway, the whole thing means that we've got to design something in order to achieve both things, development and greening, both in the south and in the north, reduction, dematerialization, and a different way, not through degrowth, but through changing the nature of growth, what we do, how we do it. And that means technology in enormous quantities, well-directed, directionality, tilting the playing field, making prices be signals to doing the right thing, and more expensive if you try to do the wrong thing. So it's a complex picture. And of course, I mean, everything we're saying about hope and positive things are difficult things to do. So optimism, pessimism at the same time, and let's hope we can do it.
Optimism, realism.
Okay. Well, realism is what makes us is both. We have to be realist about both the pessimism and the optimism. The possibilities are realistic. It can be done in terms of practical things, in terms of technology, in terms of organization. The pessimism is about the institutional, the political, the powerful, the rich, the financial sector, all these things. That's where the obstacles are. We have to be realist about that too, but we have to bring it together somehow. And if we don't propose the things that could be done, however impossible they seem, they won't happen. You know, we have to look at history, and the things that happened after the Second World War were pretty much inconceivable, from having a national health service where the state took over everybody's health. That's total madness before. And it was done. And it was done, and it created that, plus all the other welfare things, created demand for business. And it was a wonderful time for business because demand was there, and they paid high salaries, of course, in exchange for low raw materials from us. So that's, you know, the capitalism is always a trade-off, very complex trade-off. Let's hope that the developing world is included on the right side of the trade-off this time, if we set it up. But I think I could speak for half an hour more, and that's very dangerous, so I shut up.
This is a very important topic, and I can see that maybe Chris.org wants to think about organizing something around this, because it really deserves much more time. Thanks so much, Carlota, for those insights. We are nearly close to the end of the session, but I would like to take one question, if the organizers allow me to, from the audience, from Andrew. Andrew, and I will write it if that I'll read it if that's okay, Andrew, rather than speaking to it, if it's fine. Raphie, I'm not sure if you can see the chat, but it relates to the earlier discussion around alternatives. You mentioned that one of the findings from I think it was related to your work in China was that, you know, that it opened space for this thinking around innovative economic alternatives. So Andrew is asking, what have you learned about the development of innovative economic alternatives and the capabilities of actors promoting them to transform the structural conditions of non-inclusion and non-sustainability, brackets, bad development? What does it mean in this type of country and territorial context?
Sorry, say that again.
If you don't mind, what have you learned about the development of innovative economic alternatives and capabilities in the context of developing countries? If you don't mind answering it in 2 minutes, so we don't go too much into the time.
When I began, I would have said what we in the rich countries do to help developing countries do that. Now there are so many capabilities in developing countries that really these are issues which can be solved internally in developing countries and between developing countries. So I think there's enormous potential. But as innovation scholars, we cannot understand that purely as a technical issue. That is the design of the national system of innovation or the design of educational programs. They're all important, but ultimately we go back to the 75% excluded population and how they're to be included and their dynamic potential to be realized. And that essentially is an issue of politics, and I have no answer to that. But I'm sure it's the key issue.
Okay, so we are, thanks Raphie, we are 1 minute over, but I think we've had a great discussion. I would like to thank the two discussants, Mike Morris and Carlota Perez, for really nice questions and engagement, and obviously Raphie for a really fantastic conversation. I'll pass it back to Justina to wrap up the session.
Can I have 1 minute, please?
Oh, please, yes, go ahead.
I've been very privileged to have this, and I'm extremely grateful to it. I'm grateful, of course, to Carlotta and Mike, not just for their comments now, but for sharing your time with me over the years. Erika, you've become a very important colleague to me, and you're a wonderful interlocutor. Justina, thank you. But Rajesh, wherever you are on the screen, without you, none of these things will have happened. And I think I personally, but as a community, we owe you an enormous debt of gratitude for what you've done to revive the innovation studies discipline, particularly in the developing world, and particularly in a way which allows us to work together. So I would like to thank Rajesh particularly for wonderful, wonderful support. Sorry, Erika.
Thank you very much, Raphie. I think, yes, we have to join our hands together once again to clap for Rajesh. He's doing an amazing job with the organization of this series. So we'd like to say a very big thank you to the organizers, to Raphie, to Erika for leading such a very insightful discussion. I think it would have gone on and on and on, especially with the last point that Carlotta made. It was very rich, and we want to thank all of you for participating today. I think one key thing that I would like to pick, and then maybe all of us share, especially as a young scholar, Raphie made a statement. He said, you need to know why you do it. So it's not just about research. It's not just about getting publications out. They are all important. But he said, remember, we are social actors and we have to make the world sustainable. So in conducting our research, what is our motive? What is the innovative performance that we are looking at? I think it should matter to all of us. And he said he's ready to mentor. So the young scholars who are here on this platform, Erika, Raphie, and almost all the discussants are here ready to mentor all of us. Thank you so much. And we look forward to your participation in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can all of us switch on the camera so that we can have a picture? Is it possible? A brief moment. Indu, can you take a picture? Somehow I am unable to take a picture.
This isn't the best background, but anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Cameras, please.
Have to take several pictures.
I think we have to smile, actually.
Indu, please take
That's
picture.
too serious.
It's already done.
Already. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erika. Great sharing.
Yeah,
That was a great session.
amazing.
Thank you, Erika.
Thank you.
Yeah.